Hello, sweet friends. Thank you so much for joining me. I am really excited about this new sewing project that I'm starting. It is going to be a Laura Ingalls inspired dress, and the little girl that I am making it for is Joanna Wilder, who is 6 years old. Joanna is the daughter of Jason and Paula Wilder, and you met Jason a few episodes ago in a Lessons with Laura video, and I will link down below to the video. Now, Joanna and her family are beginning to shoot a homesteading series, and it is going to be told through the eyes of Joanna. And I can't say much more than that at this time, but we are all very excited for this new production. And Joanna needed a dress to be worn in the show. And the producers were looking for something that was somewhat a cross between being historically accurate as well as something very similar as to what was worn by the actresses in the Little House series. So the pattern that I'm going to be using is McCall's 7231, and this is quite a popular pattern for those who are seeking pioneer dresses. Now, this dress that is shown in this view is somewhat historically accurate. The style was known as the Mother Hubbard dress, and I am not an academic historian by any means. I am a simple woman who just loves historic fashion. But I do like researching the fashions that I'm showing. And the Mother Hubbard style was started around the 1860s as a wrapper. And this was a garment that was to be worn at home. And it featured a yoke and gathered bodice, very loose fitting. And of course, the back of the dress was also gathered to the yoke, very loose fitting. This was a dress that was designed to be worn at home in a woman's ease for comfort. Now, of course, some ladies did choose to wear dresses such as these while they were performing their everyday chores on their farms, but it was not really the intention of the pattern producers, the dress designers, for this dress to be worn into town, because this dress could be worn without a corset. It did make it a very comfortable gown, but just as if the majority of us would not go into town today without our undergarments, ladies of that time would have not gone into town without wearing a corset. So this dress was primarily marketed to women. And the question is, well, would children have worn this style? And the artist Kate Greenaway, who also wrote many children's books, she shared artwork that was just truly charming. And you see the loose-fitting smock style, the gathered bodice to the yoke. And so I believe that children probably did wear this dress. I do need to do a bit more research. Some of the research came from an academic article entitled Searching for Mother Hubbard, Function and Fashion in 19th Century Dress. And I will link down to that article in the description. And it primarily does talk about ladies. Now, the majority of the Mother Hubbard dresses just show either a round neck or a short band collar. So the very large Peter Pan collar that comes on this pattern is not really historically accurate, and that is something that I will be eliminating from the design that I am creating for Joanna. So the question then becomes, okay, well then how do we finish the neckline? Which on this dress, I'm just going to make a very curved neckline on the dress. And for that, I am still taking the collar pattern piece, but I have left it in a way that it is not rounded at the ends, and I'm going to create a facing so it will be sewn to the neckline of the dress and then tucked in. And as we go along in the sewing process, I will certainly share that. Other forms that I am doing as a nod to historical accuracy is the garment is 100% cotton, and I will be using cotton thread. Now, I very specifically chose images that showed blue dresses, and a book that I often refer to is called Dating Fabrics, and again I will link to this. And you do see that the color I have selected is very much historically accurate, but the design of the fabric is not quite historically right through the placement of the flowers, and there is also between 4 and 5 different colorways between the tan leaves and the small white flowers and the light blue flowers. So you wouldn't have really seen that abundance of color in a printed cotton at that time. But in working with the budget I have, which is 0, I found this through my good friend D'Artagnan, who graciously had this in her sewing stash. And it probably dates to the late 80s, early 90s time frame. And so I am really, really excited to get started on this project, and I hope you'll come along on the journey with me. When I share the dress, I will go ahead and wear the wrapper that I created for myself so that you can kind of see the differences in how the dresses changed through the decades, and I think it's going to be really interesting and fun. So let's get started.
One of the alterations that I am making is to the sleeve pattern. Now, traditionally, a 1880s sleeve would have an upper and lower construction formula instead of just the one solid sleeve. So in working with this, I needed to cut down the sleeve because this pattern has you gather this edge with elastic, which would have not been used during that time. So I've just narrowed the sleeve opening. I kept the head of the sleeve the same so that it will fit correctly into the armhole area, but hopefully by narrowing it, it'll give it more of the 1870s, 1880s appearance.
The dress is finished, and as promised, I am wearing a wrapper that I made last year. Now, the thing about clothing during the 1800s, it was very much like clothing today. You had styles that were sometimes popular for a short time as well as a long time. And in terms of ladies' fashions, you can often identify the date of a garment by its sleeve. The bell-shaped sleeve, which was popular in the 1940s, very similar to the pagoda sleeve, then transitioned into the popular dolman sleeve, which was much more narrow. By the 1890s, the sleeves kept getting progressively larger, and they were titled the Lego mutton sleeve. And that is the sleeve that you see on this wrapper that I made. Also, where the shoulder seam is can also be an indicator as to what year an antique garment might have been made. You know, in the 1850s, you had a very low shoulder seam and it moved progressively upward. I'm assuming to hold the weight of the larger sleeves, but again, since I'm not a fashion historian, I'm not exactly sure, but it will definitely be something that I look for in my future research. So let's talk about the Laura Ingalls Pioneer gown. As I discussed, I removed the large Peter Pan collar that came with the pattern. That was not really something that you would have seen during the time of Laura's girlhood. It would have been a band collar, similar to what is on my wrapper, or a basic curved neckline. And then often ladies and girls would often wear a collar over the neckline, and this could be removable, so it could be easily laundered. So it does have the yoke with the gathers, and the closure is 3 mother-of-pearl buttons. Now, in pioneer and antique clothing, you have a few forms of fasteners or closures that you can use. Buttons, of course, hook and eyes, as well as ties and eyelets and lacings. The zipper was not really patented as the zipper as we know it until 1917, and at that time it was titled a separate fastener. Another name for it is slide closure. You didn't really see zippers in clothing until about the 1930s. So in pioneer clothing, I always try to use either a button closure or hooks and eyes. In my dress that I wore last week, the bodice laced up with eyelet grommets and a ribbon. So as I had shown you in the previous clip, the sleeve I narrowed quite a bit from what came on the pattern because it was really too voluminous. And when you're talking about the Ingalls family, they were not a family of wealthy means, and so excess fabric for really full sleeves, you just wouldn't have wasted that fabric. They just didn't have the means to be really elaborate in their dress trimmings. So the picture that you often see of Laura at age 14, her dress is fairly plain. There's no pleating, there's no ruffles, and that's just because they did not have the money to waste in excessive fabric decorations. So I very much followed suit with a nod to what Laura would have actually worn while working on the prairie. And the back of the dress, again, is just the yoke, and it has the gathers. One area that I did deter a little bit, and I will bring it up close so you could see, is because this dress is designed for a growing girl, I added some growth tucks, and this was a technique used in clothing that as the child grew, you could unpick the thread that holds the pleat in place, and it would give you additional length. So each one of these tucks is a full 1 inch in length, making each side of the tuck 1/2 inch in length. And so this dress can actually be an additional 2 inches longer. And I did the same at the sleeve cuff, just so Joanna, as she is 6 years old, she's still very much growing. And so therefore, you know, she would perhaps outgrow the dress even before it wore out. So I wanted to give her some options that she could wear the dress for a longer length of time. Now, I decided to go ahead and just create a second yoke piece versus a facing. And why I decided to do that is because then I was able to somewhat enclose the gathered seam and make it just a little bit more smooth, more comfortable to wear. And it was at 100% sewn on a sewing machine. And I've talked about in other videos when the sewing machine was actually invented. And this was absolutely after the time of Laura was born. Many families had sewing machines. So my machine definitely runs on electricity and not a treadle, but just using a basic straight stitch on this. Now, of course, I couldn't send a pioneer dress without the other quintessential element, and that, of course, is a sunbonnet. Now, this sunbonnet is one of the views in the same pattern that I used for the dress, and it's a good time to also talk about this pattern actually uses elastic to give the ease to be worn on the head. That's really not something you would have seen during Laura's time. So I thought perhaps next week we could take a look at my collection of some antique sunbonnets, as well as some reproduction sunbonnets that I have sewn, so we can learn more a bit about that topic. Now, this fabric, if you can kind of see, the coloring is very soft and it's a little bit variegated. Can you see that? And the reason for that is because I dyed this in indigo, and indigo was a dye very much used to create the blue color shown here. And it's not really color fast. I've already told Joanna's mother, Paula, that she will need to wash the sunbonnet by itself or with blue jeans, because the dye will come out slowly each time that the sunbonnet is worn. But I thought that that was a special nod. I do always try to include an antique element in everything that I create for this era. And of course, the mother of pearl buttons featured on the dress are antique. And the wonderful thing as to why we have so many buttons still in existence is, buttons were quite precious. You would outgrow, or the garment would wear out, and you would remove the buttons to be reused. Very famously, there is a scene in which Mary and Laura are given Ma's precious tin of buttons to create a button necklace for Carrie. And so, it should be noted that they were not of the throwaway society. They repurposed, they reused, they recycled, which of course is something that we all should be doing. And I hope you have enjoyed learning just a little bit about what Laura might have worn. And I'll see you next week.